Hey friends, Uncle Nate here, back again to read in my daughter Meredith's room. We're working on The Great Brain at the Academy, and we're on chapter 3, which is called Off on the Wrong Foot. Now today I've got a little friend with me to sit for this. Um, this is Robbie Snickers, and Robbie Snickers is the guest snuggly of the day. So guest snuggly Robbie Snickers is going to sit maybe I don't know, right there, and listen very quietly and patiently as we read Chapter 3, Off on the Wrong Foot. Now, I was surprised when Tom wrote me that he had got off on the wrong foot at the academy, but that it wasn't anything serious. For my money, any trouble the great brain got into had to be serious. Papa was hoping the Jesuit priests would reform Tom. That, to me, was like hoping the priest would get rid of the freckles on Tom's face. I found out I was right when Father Rodriguez sent the first monthly report on Tom's and Swain's progress and deportment. These reports were sent to the parents of all students every month. Papa always stopped at the post office at the end of his day's work, but he never opened the mail until after supper. Mama said it was because Papa didn't want to spoil his appetite if there was any bad news in the mail. It was a good system because Papa wouldn't have been able to eat a bite if he'd read the report on Tom before supper. Papa waited until after the dishes were put away and then read the reports aloud to Mama, Aunt Bertha, and me in the parlor. He read the report on Swain first, and when he finished, he looked as pleased as a rabbit with 2 carrots. But by the time he finished Tom's report, his cheeks were so blown up with anger I thought he would blow his teeth right out of his mouth. "I'll wager they expel him and send him home," he shouted, waving the report in the air like it was a red flag and he was a bull. Mama took it very calmly. "He just needs time to adjust," she said. "Adjust?" Papa cried. "The great brain will have a difficult time adjusting in heaven." And then he added, "if he ever gets there." I didn't blame Papa for being so upset. The report was in polite language, but made it very plain that if Tom didn't mend his ways, he would be sent home. I didn't get all the details of what had happened until my brothers came home for the Christmas vacation. And of course, what Tom told me, and what Swain told me, and what Father Rodriguez wrote in his report were 3 slightly different stories. So I have to be sort of a detective to figure out exactly what happened. Tom met Swain on the platform in back of the depot in Salt Lake City. If there was any truth in that business about people turning green with envy, Swain would have been the color of our grass in the summertime. "I thought you were joking," he said, "until the conductor told me you were actually riding in the locomotive. How'd you ever pull that off?" "When a fellow has a great brain, anything is possible," Tom said, taking off the raincoat and hat. "Well, you'd better put your great brain to work on a way to get cleaned up before Father O'Malley sees you," Swain said. "You look like a chimney sweep with that soot and coal dust all over your face. Maybe you can sneak into the bathroom in the depot to wash up." But Tom didn't get a chance to wash up. Father O'Malley was waiting for them just inside the doorway of the depot. He was a middle-aged man, wearing the traditional black robe and hood of a Jesuit priest. The hood was pushed back on his neck, revealing a head that was bald except for a fringe of hair around the edges. There was a braided cord around his waist and a crucifix hanging from a chain around his neck. His cheeks were rosy red as if somebody had just pinched them. I have a little visitor with me. I'm going to have to pause for a minute to show you my little visitor here. Oh boy. This is Piper dog. Piper, say hi. Piper is my little dog, and she just had a bath, so she smells a little bit like a wet dog, and she's going to keep me company while I keep reading. Now, let's see, where were we? "Welcome back, Swain," said Father O'Malley as they shook hands. "I trust the good Lord gave you a pleasant journey from Aidenville." Then he looked at Tom. "Ah, this must be your brother Thomas," who doesn't look as if he had a pleasant journey at all. I rode in the cab of the locomotive from Provo, Tom said proudly, still thrilled by the ride. Did you now? Father O'Malley said. Well, that is something I've always wanted to do. You must tell me all about it sometime, Thomas. Please don't call me Thomas, Tom said. Sounds kind of sissified. Call me Tom instead, please. I doubt if anyone would call your patron Saint Thomas a sissy, Father O'Malley said. However, I will call you Tom if you prefer. But Father Rodriguez may take an entirely different point of view. Speaking of Father Rodriguez, Swain said, can my brother wash up before we go to the academy? Oh, I'm sorry, Swain, the priest said, but my orders are to deliver the out-of-town boys exactly the way they arrive. If it wasn't for this rule, they would all want to wash up, clean the dirt from beneath their fingernails, put on a clean shirt and necktie, and anything else that might help make a good first impression on Father Rodriguez. Swain looked at Tom. That means on your first day, you'll get demerits, he said. Did that bother Tom? Heck no! It was worth getting demerits to ride in a locomotive, he said. He followed Swain and the priest out of the depot to where several horse-drawn liveries were waiting. Their drivers were soliciting customers by proclaiming good accommodations and free transportation to the various hotels. Father O'Malley stopped when they came to a single horse hitched to a buggy with 2 seats. He got into the front seat, and Tom and Swain climbed into the rear. Have you ever been to Salt Lake City before, Tom? The priest asked. No, Father, Tom answered. Then I shall give you a very short tour of it, the priest said. Father O'Malley drove without speaking until they came to Temple Square. The 6-spired gray granite building is the temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he said. Construction was begun in 1853, but it wasn't completed until 40 years later. The big building with a roof that resembles the back of a huge tortoise is the Mormon Tabernacle. The acoustics are remarkable. You can drop a pin at one end and hear it drop at the other end 200 feet away. Tom had read all about the temple and the tabernacle, but what excited him most were the horse-drawn streetcars, the tall buildings, and the crowds of people as they drove down Main Street. They left the business district, and Father O'Malley pointed out St. Mary's Academy for Catholic Girls and the Presbyterian Westminster College. After seeing these 2 schools, Tom was very disappointed when they arrived at the Catholic Academy. Swain had told him it had once been the home of a wealthy Catholic who had donated it to the Jesuits for a school. Tom didn't blame the wealthy Catholic for not wanting to live there anymore. It might have been a nice neighborhood at one time, but now the big homes had been turned into cheap rooming houses or torn down to make way for factories and warehouses. The academy itself was a 3-story wooden building with dormer windows in the attic, making it look 4 stories tall. Its white paint was a dirty gray color from the smokestacks of surrounding factories, and so blistered with age that it was peeling from some of the boards. One side of the academy was flush up against the sidewalk. The other 3 sides were enclosed within a high rock wall that had a gate at the front entrance. Tom had to admit the grounds looked nice, with trees and shrubs and a green lawn, but one thing surprised him. There were statues of saints all over the place. It looked as if every Catholic in Salt Lake City had donated a statue of his patron saint. A gravel circular driveway led up to the entrance, where there was a huge statue of St. Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Society of Jesus. Well, Tom, Father O'Malley said as they stopped at the entrance, what do you think of the academy? Well, if you don't mind me saying so, Father, Tom said, I think it could use a little more paint and a few less statues. You are so right, the priest agreed. But I suppose we should thank the Lord that enough money was donated to remodel the home into an academy. You boys go right in. Father Rodriguez is expecting you. I must return this horse and buggy to the livery stable. Tom followed Swain up some stone steps and into the academy. They entered a long hallway with white painted walls and a highly polished hardwood floor. There was a statue of St. Paul in one corner, one of St. Anthony in another corner, and between them a statue of the Virgin Mary with child. Swain put down his suitcase and pointed to a large room at the left. It was furnished with chairs and tables, and there were bookcases filled with books covering 2 of the walls. "That is the library and visiting room," Swain said. "On the same side down the hall in the dining room and beyond it is the kitchen. On the right is Father Rodriguez's office, and next to it his bedroom. Then comes the chapel and the bedrooms of the other priests. The stairway at the end of the hall leads up to the classrooms on the 2nd floor and the dormitory on the 3rd floor. Maybe you can sneak up to the washroom and clean up before we see Father Rodriguez." "It wouldn't do any good," Tom said. "Father O'Malley is sure to mention to him how I look." "We'll leave our suitcases here," Swain said. Then he walked over and knocked on a door that had a brass plate on it, reading, "Father Rodriguez, Superintendent." "Come in," a baritone voice called. If Tom had known what that deep voice had in store for him, he would have taken Swain's advice and tried to sneak upstairs. But the trouble was that Tom judged all Jesuit priests by the only priest he knew, Father Joe. His real name was Father Giovanni, but nobody could pronounce it right, so everybody just called him Father Joe. He was known as the priest on horseback because he covered such a big territory all over southwestern Utah. Father Joe only came to Adenville once a year for 1 week. During that week, he baptized Catholic babies, married Catholics, and held confessions and masses in the community church because we didn't have a Catholic church in Adenville. Father Joe was a regular fellow who smoked cigars and wasn't above taking a nip now and then. During Father Joe's last visit to Adenville, Tom had borrowed books from the priest about the Society of Jesus and spent hours questioning Father Joe. Tom believed he had to know all about the Jesuits because he was going to a Jesuit academy. He learned that the Society of Jesus was founded in 1534 by St. Ignatius Loyola and 6 companions in Paris. They submitted a constitution for the religious order to Pope Paul III in 1540. It was approved a year later, and St. Ignatius was elected general of the order. The society grew in numbers until the 1660s and the 1670s, when monarchs, jealous of the Jesuits' power, suppressed the order in the Spanish dominions and in France. Later, Pope Clement XIV dissolved the order and it ceased to exist except in Russia. It was reestablished in 1814 by Pope Pius VII and became the largest religious order in the Catholic Church. The Jesuits distinguished themselves in 3 fields: their foreign missions, Jesuit schools, and their study of the arts and sciences. They were the first Christian missionaries to live with the American Indians, where they were known as the Black Robes. They preached Christianity and taught many Indian chiefs the French and English languages. Well, Tom learned that it took 16 years to become a Jesuit priest. A novice had to spend 2 years in spiritual training and then take the 3 vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. He then became a scholastic. He spent 5 years studying the arts and sciences, 5 years teaching, 3 more years of theological study, and finally another year of spiritual training before he could be ordained a Jesuit priest. Oh yes, Tom knew a great deal about the Jesuits, but what he didn't know was that the only resemblance between Father Joe and Father Rodriguez was that both of them were Jesuit priests. The superintendent was sitting behind a desk in a very sparsely furnished office when Tom entered with Swain. The only furniture was the desk and a chair and a large bookcase. There was a large crucifix on the white wall behind the desk, and near it a narrow board with a peg from which hung a ring of keys. There wasn't even a carpet on the floor. Tom began to think that if this was the best they could do for the superintendent, the students must have to sleep on the floor. Father Rodriguez was a man Tom judged to be about 45. The priest was wearing the traditional black robe with the hood pushed to the back of his neck. He had jet black hair and a swarthy complexion inherited from his Spanish ancestors. But the dominant impression Tom had of the superintendent were the eyes and the face. The eyes were as black as wet coal, and the stern face looked as if it would break if the priest smiled. "Welcome back to the academy, Swain," he said in his deep voice. "I see that God has treated you well during your vacation." "Thank you, Father," Swain said. "I'm happy to be back. May I present my brother Thomas?" Father Rodriguez stared at Tom with those coal black eyes. "Well, Thomas, what have you to say for yourself?" he asked. "I guess you mean about the way I look?" Tom said. "I rode in the cab of the locomotive from Provo to Salt Lake City, and please, I would rather be called Tom, not Thomas." If Tom expected the superintendent to react the same way as Father O'Malley, he was as mistaken as a rabbit that challenges a hound dog to a fight. "We expect our students to be presentable when they arrive," the priest said sternly. "Your punishment for arriving in this condition will be 5 days of peeling potatoes in the kitchen. And here at the academy, Thomas, you will be known by the name you were baptized." Tom didn't think the priest was being fair. It was a great honor to ride in a locomotive. Father Rodriguez acted as if it was no more than riding a horse. At home, Papa always encouraged us boys to speak up if a punishment seemed unfair. So Tom said, "I don't think I should be punished for doing something every kid in the world dreams of doing." "What you think and what I think are two different matters," Father Rodriguez said sharply. "And your insolence to your superiors is going to cost you 5 demerits. There is more to getting an education than just putting knowledge in your head. The purpose of this academy is to guide, nourish, and stimulate a boy's mind and heart, and to develop intelligent, spiritually vigorous, cultured, healthy, vocationally prepared, and socially minded American Catholics. And part of that training is to instill in you respect for your elders and superiors." Did that shut Tom up? Heck no! He was so angry that he didn't use his great brain at all. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I still don't think it's right to be punished for riding in a locomotive." "That remark is going to cost you another 5 demerits," the superintendent said. "We shall tame your tongue and your temper, Thomas, and believe me, we shall tame you." Swain tried to put in a word for Tom. "Please, Father," he pleaded, "my brother isn't used to priests. We only saw a missionary priest once a year back home. He really doesn't mean to be disrespectful." "I am aware that your brother has received very little religious instruction," Father Rodriguez said, "but neither did you, and we had no trouble at all with you last year. You were a well-behaved and model student." Tom is different because he has a great brain," Swain said. "Do you mean he is a precocious child?" Father Rodriguez asked. "That could possibly account for his being temperamental." Tom didn't like having the priest and Swain discuss him as if he weren't even in the room. "I'm not a child," he said. "I'm almost 12 years old, and I'm just as level-headed as the next fellow." The superintendent's eyes seemed to become even darker, and the stern face more unyielding as he looked at Tom. "Your father wrote me that I could expect some trouble with you," he said, to Tom's astonishment. "I will now give you fair warning, Thomas. If you want to remain here, you will obey all the rules and regulations and show proper respect for your elders and superiors. Is that understood?" "Yes," Tom answered. "Yes, what?" the superintendent asked. "Yes, Father," Tom said. Tom admitted he felt completely defeated at that moment. It wasn't due to Father Rodriguez. Just knowing that Papa had so little confidence in him, he felt as if his own flesh and blood had deserted him. Then the superintendent appeared to relax a little as he leaned back in his chair. "If you have any money you want to turn over to me," he said, "you may do so. There is no place to spend it inside the academy, and one of the rules of the academy is that candy is forbidden, except on every fourth Saturday. It is bad for a boy's teeth and health. If you have any candy, you must turn it over to me. I will send it to the orphanage." Now that was one time Tom sure as heck wanted to say what was on his mind. If candy was bad for the teeth and the health of the boys at the academy, why wasn't it bad for the kids in the orphanage? But he used his great brain and kept his mouth shut, knowing it would only mean more demerits. Swain said, "I knew better than to bring any candy with me." Tom knew he couldn't lie to a priest, but the candy had cost him 60 cents. His great brain came to the rescue. "I haven't any candy on me," he said, which was the truth because the candy was in his suitcase and not on his person. Swain looked so startled Tom was afraid our brother would spill the beans. Fortunately, the superintendent was looking at him, not at Swain. "You two are the last to arrive," Father Rodriguez said. "Swain, you take bunk number 10 on the 8th grade side and show your brother to bunk number 10 on the 7th grade side. You are both excused." If I had been in Tom's shoes, I wouldn't even have unpacked my suitcase. Any fellow who could get 10 demerits in about 10 minutes was sure to get another 10 in a hurry and be expelled. "It didn't take you long to get Father Rodriguez down on you," Swain said when they were in the hallway. "And you get caught with that candy in your suitcase, you'll be expelled for sure." "You signed a statement not to interfere," Tom said as they picked up their suitcases. Swain just shook his head as they walked down the hallway. "Want to see the chapel?" he asked. Tom had never been inside a Catholic church or even seen a chapel. "Sure," he said. Tom was surprised at how beautiful the chapel was after the austerity of the superintendent's office. The altar was made from stone, with a crucifix and a tabernacle to contain the reserved host in the middle. There were small statues of saints in niches on the walls. On one side of the altar was a statue of the Virgin Mary, and on the other a statue of St. Jude Thaddeus. Next to each was a confessional, and the chapel was one place where there was carpeting in the aisle. "Don't they have an organ and a choir?" Tom asked. "They're going to try to raise enough money to buy an organ this year," Swain answered. "And Father O'Malley picks just 6 boys each year for the choir. I'm going to light a candle and say a prayer to St. Jude for you." Catholics only prayed to St. Jude when their troubles seemed hopeless and desperate. Swain did the right thing in asking St. Jude to help Tom. He knew he was going to need all the help the saint could give to prevent the great brain from being expelled from the academy. Right then, Tom was feeling pretty hopeless and desperate himself. He had only been in the academy about 15 minutes and already had received 10 demerits and 5 days of peeling potatoes as punishment. But he didn't want Swain to know how he felt. So he knelt in the back row of the chapel and said a universal prayer for all things necessary to salvation. It was a good choice, in my opinion, because part of that prayer was asking God to make Tom always remember to be submissive to his superiors. They left the chapel, and after picking up their suitcases, walked up to the 2nd floor. The 7th grade classroom's on the left, Swain said, and the 8th grade classroom's on the right. There's a washroom and a dispensary at the end of the hall. Father Rodriguez takes care of any boy who gets sick. Then Swain put his arm around Tom's shoulders. As brother to brother, do me and yourself a favor, TD, he said, calling Tom by his initials because that's how Papa often addressed us. We all had the same middle name, Dennis, because of a family tradition. What favor? Tom asked. Get rid of the candy in your suitcase, Swain said. We can go into the washroom on this floor and open a window and just throw it down into the street. No, Tom said. Look, if it's the money you're worrying about, Swain said, I'll give you the 60 cents just to get rid of it. Now that for my money was a darn generous offer for Swain to make. But did Tom accept it? Heck no. His money-loving heart wouldn't let him. Why should I sell the candy to you for 60 cents when there are kids in the dormitory who'll give me $1.20 for it? He asked. Now that made Swain angry, and who could blame him? Try to save Tom. He was willing to hand over a small fortune. There is a limit to my brotherly love, he said. If you think that I'm going to let you connive me out of $1.20, you are sadly mistaken. Little brother, go ahead and get yourself expelled. I'm afraid even St. Jude can't help you. You know what your trouble is, SD? Tom said. Like all people with little brains, you worry about things that'll never happen. But Tom was going to learn as time passed that even people who have great brains can get into plenty of trouble. And that's the end of that chapter. Robbie Snickers and I had a good time, and we will see you next time for Chapter 4.